Somehow news spread quickly. By lunchtime, Eastgate Street was solid with people. Businessmen, farmers, anyone who'd managed to squirrel a little money away, now desperate to get it out. By noon we were forced to turn away customers. No more funds. Nothing left at all. Young Mr. Dixon sent for old Mr. Dixon, but when we broke the news to him, I was sorry we had. I have never seen a man look so stricken. For a couple of hours we left him to see his oldest customers, but then I was sent in to fetch him. "Mr. Dixon says we can manage from now on, sir, if you'd like to go." Then I took his arm as he rose to his feet. "I've had grown men crying in here this afternoon," he said, patting my hand. "One cannot help but think of our dear Mr. Brassy and wish him well." Then, as he took his hat, he turned slightly to look at me. "You're a good man, Crawford." And as I helped him into his carriage in Foregate Street, he lost his balance for a moment, and a thought came, unbidden and unwanted, into my head, that this might be the last time I'd see him.
Dominique Verdier, French governess, Merseyview Cottage, Birkenhead, 1828. That Mr. Brassy, I do not like him. Par instance, when he comes here, he makes it quite obvious what he's after. Maria. And Maria, for her part, is doing rien to discourage him. They think we're fools, those two. How she thinks no one sees, but of course we do. We see how her eyes keep glancing from her book to his face. But then, if they happen to meet his, mon Dieu, she looks so quickly away. I know what this is. L'amour. A beast I know too well. So often it comes when it is least wanted. And yet, here, it seems this l'amour is wanted very much. As I look around the room, I see it plain in every face. So, today, we go out. He has a little horse, this Mr. Brassy, and a little cart. "To West Kirby," he says, "the beach, to buy shrimps. It is a fine thing to do, to sit in the sun, to eat a little bread and butter and drink a little tea." Shrimps? I think to myself, this man is a fool. How can he hope to woo a girl with shrimps? Well, it seems this Mr. Brassy is very rich. The place we go to has very good style, and there are shrimps, but there are also tiny cakes with little forks on little plates. Ah, so this Mr. Brassy is a man who knows how to live. And then I think, perhaps my dear Maria could do worse than marry this Mr. Brassy, who can give her such a life. And what do they talk about, these two? How he owns a brickyard and kiln, and how these are going very nicely, and then how one day the famous Mr. Stevenson came to the quarry he runs, and this man was so impressed with it that he gave Mr. Brassy advice. And this advice was, railways were the thing. And if Mr. Brassy wanted to make his mark, then the best thing he could do was make a railway bid. "And did you?" asks Maria. And he said he had, and that although he had not won his bid, this Mr. Stevenson told him he should have another go, soon. Now, my dear Maria has gone very quiet. This is always a sign that she has much interest. And then, at the end of the quiet, she says, "But you should. You absolutely should." And for a while, they just sit there, looking at each other. And since I have very much thirst, I pick up the pot of tea, and I'm just about to begin to pour when I hear. But of course, for that, I'd need a wife. Mon Dieu! The tea is everywhere! Over the cloth, over the floor, and Mr. Brassy and my little Maria are on their feet, and the waitress comes running with a cloth and the mop. And after everything is quiet again, I wonder if I really heard. But I did.
A single blow. That's all I need. How hard, how soft the conversation we have is louder than anything else. Stop for a minute, Nathaniel. I squint upwards. That new boss, Mr. Brassy. I want a word. I look at him, trying to work out what he said, because again, the rock is noisy in my head. You're from Mr. Price's way, aren't you? Near Wrexham? Nod. Come on, man. Tell me more than that. I've been here 2 years, like. And before that, an apprentice? Like you, sir, I hear. Can you read, Nathaniel? A little, I say. And I say just a little too. Come on, man. We're the same age, you and I. Both making our way in the world. Except that we're not the same, I think. Not the same at all. Otherwise, why am I the one taking orders and he be the one giving them? He stands for a moment, his hand on his chin. Hear the sound of the stubble rasping under his fingers. I need men to build a bridge in Penketh. Men that I know I can rely on to work hard, and of course I thought of you. So, what do you think? What I think is, it doesn't matter. If he says I must go, then I must go. That is the way of the world. And, what would you like me to do there, sir? What do you think? I want you to take the rock and perform your magic on it. I want blocks to be perfect squares, bricks lined up. I want people to come and see it years from now, long after we're dead and gone, and to know it was done well. It would take a few months, mind, and we'd all have to move out there. Would you mind that? I think about it for a while. I think about my little room in Staunton, where my every movement is watched. I think about my Sundays off in Birkenhead, in its courts, shared middens. Not at all, sir. When do we start?
My father was a drover of cows, and for a long time I was his mate. Fine herds he'd get. Black and white critters, heavy and mooing. And promised me riches in Chester if I'd look out at the back. But the riches never came my way. And one day, after a woman told me what a mug I was being, I slunk away in the night to where a line was being cut. and in the morning came upon a couple of lads in high boots, hats and fancy jerkins. "Hey, look at that, Red," one of them said when he saw me. "There's a stray child just there." "I'm no child," I said, showing him my fist. "Hey, put that away, Tranquility Joe," he said, laughing. "There's no need for that." Tranquility Joe. From then on, that was my name. Red Whippet, Nobby Trent, and Tranquility Joe. 3 of us together on the tramp. They'd be on the lookout for us sometimes. Men loitering at crossroads. Big mouth gangers, some of them. Rates dependent on demand, job done, and we'd be off again. Sleeping in barns and fields and filching whatever we could from careless farmers and housewives. When the weather was good, it was a fine life. Oh, but when the weather turned, we'd take whatever was offered. That's how we first encountered Brassy. Basingstoke, it was, and the foreman there confused my name with my nature. "Tranquility, is it?" he said, and assigned me to the horses. But that night, Nobby and Red were peevish. "Doesn't seem right, man, does it?" I heard Nobby grumble. "The 2 of us filling wagon loads with muck while Tranky there swans around like a lord steering the horses." "Shut it, Nobby," I said. "Nothing I can do about it, is there?" "Could if you wanted," Nobby said, poking me in the ribs. "I wouldn't even if I could now, you moaning little turd." "Hey, Tranky, keep a civil mouth," Red said. So I swung at him too. Now, it just so happens that the muck dug away from a cutting is exactly what's needed to build up an embankment. And the best way to do this is the tip. The truck with the muck is harnessed to a horse, and that horse is made to trot, then gallop along a track to the top until, at a cry, the harness springs loose, leaving the wagon to overturn as it hits a plank across the line, and its muck joins the rest at the bottom of the incline. Only once it goes wrong. Old Nobby fails to leap free, and the whole lot falls. Muck, horse, and man. Brassy saw to the doctor, the hospital, and the service, and the wake. And even though it was his work that caused old Nobby to die, we thank Brassy for all he did for us. Because we knew plenty of others that wouldn't.
"I absolutely forbid you to go, Mary," he said. One of Edwin's more direct orders, that one. Well, what can I do after that but wait? Just for a couple of days. Until 2 p.m. the following Sunday, to be precise. A time when Edwin can be relied upon to be ensconced in his study with the evening sermon and get the pony and trap readied for a little excursion. It is sadly a gloomy day, the sort we see rather too much of in Cumbria. The promise of drizzle and too little sun. Still, after an hour or two, I'm on the moors and in sight of Edwin's forbidden land. It doesn't look like much. From a distance, some uneven heath. Up close, a selection of turf huts with chimneys, doors and windows. I am surprised to see no one much about. Through one window I see a woman of about 60 stirring a pot, and then, by a beck, another one scrubbing clothes with a board. When she sees me, she gives me something so close to a snarl that I back away. There's a whiff of dirty clothing or something worse when the wind blows towards me, which makes me wonder about the privies. By now I've attracted a few whippet-like dogs, the sort that poachers prefer, and sure enough, hanging just within the doorways, I can just see a couple of rabbit corpses, their hind legs tied together with string. Then I notice a few other things. A rudimentary path picked out with pebbles, and then a small hut with Rose Cottage daubed inexpertly on the door. "The officer's house, that be," says a voice behind me. It's the woman with the washboard. "And along there, t' boss is talking about landing us wi' a mission." "Mission?" she spits. "What hath the Lord gi'n us then, I'd like to know? Nowt but misery and bad fortune, that's what. Next time I sees that Mr. Brassey, I'll tell him just where he can stick his mission." She steps closer and grins. "And that'll be where the sun don't shine, if thou gets my meaning." Thomas Brassey. I stop and look at her so intently it is her turn to back away. It must be the same one. I'd heard he'd gone into railways. Difficult to believe, really, for a boy from Burton. Nothing much ever happened there. Birth, marriage, death, that's it, really. We knew them from the church at Aldford. Thomas and I had played there ever since I could remember. Quiet most of the time, but always with a little devilment about him, like his mother. I suppose that's why I liked him. Dear Lord, how I adored him. Daring each other to go just that little bit further until we'd ended up holding hands on one of the flat tombstones, side by side, like the tomb we'd seen in St. Mary's, the Lord and his Lady forever at rest. Perhaps someone saw us, or perhaps it was just a coincidence that he was whisked off to school in Chester just then. But for weeks I was sick with crying. Then one day I took a trip to Chester with my father and glimpsed him going into a school opposite St. John's, and for full 3 hours I loitered outside in the hope of arranging a tryst in the graveyard opposite. It didn't happen. Even now I dream of it. Instead, that was the fateful day I ran into Edwin. I had the impression he was someone important, so when he showed an interest I was flattered. I'd imagined all clergymen were rich as lords and did nothing all week except for Sunday. It was only on our wedding night that he chose to enlighten me. An evening of disappointments. At bedtime, nothing happened. We held hands for a while, as passively as those 2 children on the tombstone, and then turned over. Never mind, I consoled myself. There are other things we can do. Charity mainly, and lots of it, preferably the shout it from the rooftops sort to let the world know about our virtue. And luckily there's a choice of institutions and people to improve. Schools, congregation lists, the demon drink, Methodists cursing, taking the Lord's name in vain, Quakers, child labour, fallen women, Catholics. I have a feeling that the navvies are going to be the latest interest. They are clearly in need of a lot of instruction. When I am caught returning home from my latest escapade, I find a description of all the terrible ungodliness I found there a useful diversion. "They need your help, Edwin, I'm afraid," I say. And to think that Thomas Brassey lets them live like that.
The Barrington Viaduct, a thing of beauty, gracefully arcing across the valley. People came from miles away just to look at it. 100 feet high, 27 arches, and all those bricks. And it was those bricks that had fallen, one and then the next, until with a roar that had shaken the whole valley, the entire structure collapsed, except, of course, the piers. Strangely, it was the silence I remember the most. It's a wonder no one died. Instead, they emerged, stunned and silent like ghosts, their faces and clothes covered in white dust. Umberto, he has an ear for these things. He said that he could hear the bricks slipping for days. He said it was the mortar, and we all agreed. Too wet or just the wrong sort, we'll never know. But the next day, Brassy was there. Even with the rain driving down upon him, he was inspecting the stumps of the parapets and no doubt making a mental note. "A bad business, Nathaniel," he said when he saw me, "but we will have to rebuild at once." And the two of us stood in the valley with all the rubble around us, all that labour, and the thought of doing it all over again. But if Thomas Brassey has been contracted to make a railroad, then he is good as his word.
Dominique Verdier, Kensington, London, 1848. Well, it is nice to be back in England, I have to say. Strange for a French woman to say that, I know, but here we are. We had to move around, you know. Oh la la, so much moving. 4 times in England and then 3 times en France. Then back here to England. But at least 3 fine boys at the end to show for it. Ah, but it is good to be out of France. They were getting bitter, I think. You see, the British owned everything. 27 million British pounds invested, Mr. Blount said. 3/4 of French railway lines. Ah, he is a very handsome man, that Mr. Blount. Debonair, sophisticated, charmant. A friend of Monsieur Brassey's, and very, very, very rich. Then I hear Mr. Brassey tell him that he is not surprised, that the French have a much better system. Ha! Of course, none of the stupid acts of Parliament here, and the rich, greedy landowners making a pile. No. En France, the government decides. They plan the route, and then go to the landowner. That way, it is all planned. There is just one railway line connecting one place to the next, while in England it is a mess. Par instance, in Chester, where Mr. Brassey used to live when he was a child, sometimes 2 trains leave for London at once. But they leave the station in opposite directions. Which is why the French railways were paying well at first, Mr. Blount said. Mr. Blount is a banker, you see, so he knows such things. A 10% dividend, which is very good. So everyone is happy. The French had their railways, and the English had their money. And everyone was offering new work to Mr. Brassey because it was going so well. Mr. Blount found the promise of money, and Mr. Brassey found more men and built more railways. But then, in an instant, everything changed. One of the railways Mr. Brassey was making in Britain failed to make money. Then another one. It was because of these acts, you see, greedy landlords charging too much money. Then there were rumours. Rumours are very bad in banking, says Mr. Blount. Investors, he says, are like sheep, nervous. The slightest worry, and they all running in the same direction without knowing why. Then, worse than this, France had yet another revolution, and Mr. Blount's good friend, King Louis Philippe, had to go. And so, then did we. Maria, the children, the servants, and me. At first, I thought it was going to be very bad, but it wasn't. It was just another move, and we were used to that. So, here we are, 516 Lowndes Square in Chelsea. It is a very fine place. One of our neighbours is the Queen, no less, in her Buckingham Palace. My countrymen are so fickle. 1 minute they're all for one king, the next minute that same king is out, and there's another to take his place. But King Louis Philippe was wise. He knew when it was time to go, and so he went, immediately. But poor Mr. Blount was ruined. His money is gone. And if Mr. Blount has no money, that means Mr. Brassy has no money either. What can he do? What he always does, I suppose. Carry on. And look for other opportunities. Anywhere. Anywhere at all.
When I first came to this land, I was not a wealthy man. So I bought myself a farm and I did what
Well, I'll say this much. The pay is good. Almost half as much again compared with home. And just recently, it's gone up again when the cold hit and some of the lads decided to head for home. 6 shillings a day! And today, more again, as even that's proved not to stem the flow. 7 and 6! Oh, hell's teeth! An absolute fortune! And of course, a little more still for us gangers. And it's just as cheap to live over here as it is in old England. Especially when there's so little to spend it on. The reason is that labour is short. It's always the same in these godforsaken places. Settlers too busy with their farms. And on top of that, there's been a boom in wheat thanks to the war with Russia, so Mr. Brassey has had to resort to bringing his own men again. 3,000 of us! All paid Canadian standard rate. Some nights, I'm shivering in my bunk. I think about something Mr. Brassey said. He was having words with an engineer, see. Some of them are right upstarts. A year in engineering school and they think they know the lot. I was trying to look as if I wasn't listening, but he gestured for me to come close. So tell me, Tranquility, how do you see it? If we continue ploughing through this bluff, we'll have to add supports, yes or no? Yes, no question, Mr. Brassey, I said. Thank you, he said, giving me a wink. That's all I want to know. And then, turning back to this engineer, had said, Tranquility here has more common sense than any man around here. I'd trust him with my life. Then, after this engineer had gone huffing and puffing down the line, and I didn't know where to look for pleasure and embarrassment, he said, I mean it, Tranquility. And if you ever consider setting yourself up as a subcontractor, I'd be delighted to help. So now I do think of it. All the time. But there's still another winter to get through, when we'll be back on the track in the cold. Sometimes it's been 50 below, and when the winds turn to blow upstream, we've just had to stop. Before all that, though, is the summer. And with all this warm weather, The boys seem out of sorts. Some of them are still in bed. I'm beginning to suspect from their groans that some of last night's beer might be off. But when I reach town, that seems quiet as well. What is it? I ask a man who's walking too quickly past me. Is there something wrong? Then he says a word in French, which I think I don't understand, but then I realise it's the same in English too. Cholera.
And I called my farm, muscle in my arm, and I called my shack, break on my back. But the land was sweet and good, and I did what I could.
Not doing too well at the moment, Edwin says, his newspaper spread across the table. You're Mr. Brassey. He's not my Mr. Brassey, I tell him. Looks to me like he's in deep water, he says cheerfully. Something to do with that railway he's building across Canada. Tutting. He knows I hate that. Word is his capital's exhausted. He's trying to get the Canadian government to bail him out. It looks like the idiots are going to do it. He cranes over to read a little more. Have to, I suppose. No point in having a half-built railway line. Falls silent then, reading the rest with an expression of satisfied amusement. Oh, he's going over there, it says here. There's going to be a bit of a fuss, apparently.
Edwin's right about the fuss. Special trains from New York, feasts and festivities at every stop. Even in Canada there's a fine display, like royalty, someone says. I shut my eyes and imagine being there alongside him. Oh, if only I'd loitered outside that school a little longer. Maybe then Thomas Brassey would have caught a glimpse of me and we could have had that tryst in St. John's churchyard. Then my life would have been entirely different. When I say different, I mean better.
Since that hour on the moor, I've discovered that Thomas Brassey is actually close to a saint. He pays fairly and very well. And at every camp, he makes sure there's a library and a minister. He's even been known to build a church and a school. And he pays all the hospital and funeral bills. Or rather disappointing as far as Edwin's concerned.
And then there was that business in the Crimea. Even Edwin had to admit to being impressed at that. Somehow or other by we I mean the British, had been sucked into a war with Russia. I'm not sure how. Something to do with Turkey. We'd cornered the Russians in a town called Sebastopol, and for some reason were hunkered down on a ridge nearby just looking at them. But a hurricane had made the supply road into a quagmire and nothing could get through. Every day we'd hear about how they were starving in the cold with no food, clothing or medical supplies. An utter disgrace, said Edwin. But, fanfare please, enter Morton Peto, Edward Betts and our Mr. Brassey. Oh yes, he was our Mr. Brassey then, and even caught Edwin saying it. They suggested that they replace the road with a railway and do the whole thing at cost, what's more. Not quite as charitable as it sounds, is that? Edwin says sniffily. Merely an excellent way of using up old stock, so I've heard. Some of it in very poor repair. But the PM agreed to it anyway. And, well, they did it. Brassey's men set sail in December and 3 months later they'd reached the top of the escarpment with the food and bandages, and the worst was over.
People forget though, don't they? For a week or so you're the toast of the town, and the next week it's back to sniping and everyone waiting for you to fail. Look at Edwin. Too good to be true, he says. I always knew it. But I keep remembering Thomas Brassey's eyes. Even as a child he had a way of gazing at you as if you were the most important thing in the world. They were kind too, those eyes. Just the right sort of creases round them.
As soon as we come into Montreal, we hear of this plague in the Irish 10 years ago. As if the famine and the 12-week crossing hadn't been enough. Some deadly illness came along with them and killed thousands. Just a small mound and a cross marks their burial. I try not to look at it as I pass it each day, but I do. And sometimes I think it's the same plague that comes back every year. Last year, for instance, all work was stopped. What a strange climate it is. Cold enough to freeze your hand to the spade in the winter, but hot enough to burn it in the summer. As if it was two different places, two different rivers. Summer, and the St. Lawrence River is fast flowing, wide and deep. By autumn, 20-foot high ice packs float by. December, it is quiet. The two shores are connected by a solid white mass. Spring, it breaks with the thunderous crashes, and it returns to its busy summer state once again. This is the river we are attempting to bridge. When we finish, it will be the longest bridge in the world. That genius Stevenson designed it. An extension of the tubular design as seen in Anglesey. We start with the caissons, strange high ring-shaped boats, reinforced in case of collision. It takes 4 days to position these midstream at the sites of the piers. Another day or two to fasten them down to the riverbed with pilings. Then these odd-shaped boats are scuttled and sheets of metal are fastened around their central cavities, and the water is pumped away until you can see the riverbed, which is sealed into place with puddle clay. The first time we do this, we have a party on the riverbed, and Mr. Brassy is over from England to propose the toasts, and while the mighty St. Lawrence is making the walls creak around us, he stands, raises his glass. Here's to America! Here's to the way they do things! So much energy, so many ideas! We stand for a moment, just looking at him. He seems oddly alien and exotic, but at the same time reminds us of home that we haven't seen in months. And it hits me in the stomach. His eyes move over our faces until they rest on me. Nathaniel! How good to see you again. How's it all going? For a few seconds, I can't speak. Umberto and the rest of the men are watching my face, waiting. It's hard work, sir, I tell him, and he's quiet. And I know I should stop. But having started, I somehow go on. The cold, the cholera, the fight for men. None of it's working. For a few moments, all is quiet, apart from the creaking of the caissons. I know, he says. I know. But it will get better, he says, trying to smile again. And it's gone. And I wish I hadn't spoken.
You know when a storm is brewing? You know when it seems the world is holding its breath while the clouds gather dark and thick overhead? That's how it's felt all year. I keep telling myself I'm lucky. That once again, old man Brassy has found us all something to keep us busy. And although it was hard finding a way through those Welsh mountains, and a line, perhaps an unimportant one in the great scheme of things, you're still here, Tranquility, me old mate. Just ballad till Dolgethley it may be, but it's still vital to someone. You're still going strong. But I felt it. That dread. It was there in each chapel we encountered, each unknowable song, each sudden ache in my legs and back. Something was coming. So it's a relief now. It's finally here. Another crash, they say. That's all it is. Well, we've all seen one of those before, we say. And nothing much happened that time. As long as old man Brassy keeps paying us the money, and we hand it out to our gangers and they pay it out to their men, other nobbies, other whippets, other Tranquility Joes, then why should this be any different? But this crash has a different silence following it. A longer one. And what follows seems a little more frantic. Every day brings news, and although we try to hide it from the men, they know. How long will this work last? How long will they be paid?
"8 o'clock, and the crowd has gone. I breathe out slowly and look around me. The sun is setting at the end of Watergate Street, its weak light picking out the new building work round me. And there, in front of me, the Wardle and Dixon Bank. Not quite grand enough to compete with London's collection, perhaps, but close. The new building had been the realisation of old Mr. Wardle's ambitions. One to go with an extensive collection of good causes, the Mechanics' Institute, his almshouses, and the ragged schools. "Tell me, Samuel," he asked me one day, "why are those children not at school?" I'd been 20 years at Wardle and Dixon's by then, and made steady progress through the ranks to clerk. When I told him even the bluecoats wouldn't take children if they didn't have shoes, I could see he was interested. "So there is little chance for them," he muttered. And that was the start of an all-absorbing obsession that was to last him the rest of his days. Schools that would take the most poor and give them a trade. That is the most glorious thing about our age, Samuel. With ambition and a little help, it is possible to rise from gruel to dining with emperors, like Mr. Brassy. Hardly a day went past without a mention of Mr. Brassey by either Mr. Dixon. I found him first, William, or Mr. Wardle. But it was I who suggested we should agree to his loan. Mr. Wardle explained it to me once, the necessity for any ambitious businessman to take loans. Without it, things stultify. With it, they can invest in trade and new ventures, and the wealth of England grows. And this is how Mr. Brassey's business grows too. He borrows to build his railway lines, and then invests what he makes from those to build more. It is this that motivates people like Mr. Brassey. They want to make, to do, to employ people and be useful, a lesson to us all. So, in reality, Mr. Brassey owns very little. Less than you might think. What happens if he loses what he borrows? Oh, well, then he could borrow some more. But what if no one can lend it to him? Oh, there's always someone that can. There are bigger banks than us, Samuel. Glyn's, for instance, or Gurney and Overend. They always have enough for anyone, and are happier to take risks. And after the £1 million loss from the Canadian trunk, this is exactly what Mr. Brassey did. He sent out agents to the young and poor countries that wanted to count, and to the unstable countries desperate to make an impression. India, Spain, Argentina, Denmark, Brazil, and Australia. A few made profit, several broke even, many lost, sometimes heavily. But through all of it, Thomas Brassey seems unperturbed. But recently there have been rumours, the threat of war in Europe, a plunge in the price of Indian cotton, and then news that all was not well in Gurney and Overend. And today we have found that all of it is true. Sometimes even the safest bank fails, and with it the most reliable contractor, and then everything else comes crashing down around them, affecting everyone.
Edwin says he may have some news today. What sort, I say? Very interested. Wait and find out, he says, and then disappears into his study where he's been spending so much time of late. This, of course, is a good thing because it has meant that I've been able to enjoy letters from home in relative peace. The talk in Alford is all about Thomas Brassey and how he's coping with this banking crash. One of my mother's friends knows someone who's friendly with one of the clerks at Glyn's who was actually there when Brassey came in with the begging bowl. The story is that Brassey was loaned £30,000 on the strength of some securities and advised to lay low, but managed to give away a third of it before he'd even left the building. But then another friend who knows the family very well says that he's digging deep, realising every asset and taking loans from friends just to keep going. I'm musing over this when Edwin skips in from his study brandishing the newspaper. Look, he says, long article here about Brassey's debts. Seems like they might have reached some crisis point. What on earth can he do, I ask him after I've read it. I doubt there's any way back for him after this. Man's pretty much sunk, I should think. With this, there's a tap on the door and the maid enters with a letter. Edwin pounces on it so hard the poor girl has trouble keeping hold of the plate. He reads it quickly, then looks up. Well, Mary, he says, you may congratulate me. What for? I say. You are speaking to the new archdeacon. What's that? I ask. something important. Only 1 or 2 down from the bishop, he says. And for once in his life, Edwin's grin fails to irritate me.
And still Mr. Brassy goes on, paying the men, sending out agents, business as usual. But now, for the first time since I've known him, he's doing something else. He's accepting loans from friends. Maybe he could just ride it out, Mr. Dixon says during our afternoon tea. If he could only finish that Austrian railway, he'd have a lot of money coming to him. But from what I heard, there's a good few weeks' work left yet, and if the men don't get paid, they'll leave to attend to the harvest. He sups on his tea, and then he picks up the morning's paper. And then, of course, there's this. Such dreadful timing. Indeed. I believe the front line is in exactly this area.
I'm nursing a drink when he spots me. City type. Viennese, probably. Obviously after something. Are you the one who can drive the trains, he asks. Might be, I say. Depends on who's asking. Victor Offenheim, apparently. A director. One of those railway people. Someone's told me you are pretty good. What do you want, I ask? No point in beating about the bush, is there? So then I hear it. He needs to get some money through to Lemberg. Urgent, apparently. If it doesn't get through, the labourers will down tools and head back to the farms, and the line won't get finished. So will you do it, he says. Do what, I say. Drive this train I found through to Lemberg. Lemberg, I say. You mean through the front line? With all those Prussian snipers? He said, only a few, so I've heard. It only takes 1 bullet to kill you, I said. But will you do it? I shake my head. The man's an idiot. For all we know, the line's not even there anymore. Even if the bullets don't get us, we could be thrown off the track. And after that, well, we get talking. Families, our lives, our loves, our hopes. The sound of an engine, he says. The smell of the smoke. The love of a track. And so we have another drink. And another. And another. The thrill of the speed. And I think about that for a second. The engine at full pelt. The power. So, will you? He asks. She's a good engine. One of the best, I'm sure, once she's all fired up. And I'll pay you well. 100 florins if you come with me right now. I can't, I say. Who's going to look after my Anna and my little Sophia if something happens to me? We will take care of them handsomely. Mr. Brassy has a very good reputation. Brassy, I say. King of the railway. Yes. Look, why don't you just come along and see? She's older than he thinks. But she fires up well. Within a mile or so, we've raised enough steam to reach a fair old lick. And so we keep going, piling on the coal until we reached sniper country. At the first bullet, we lie flat on the footplate. And after that, very few follow. And very soon, we reach Lemberg with the money. $100 shiny florins. But I heard that Mr. Brassy had got himself a medal. Who is this Mr. Brassy? The Emperor asked, for whom men will risk their lives. But he didn't ask who dodged the bullets that day.
It seems that the completion of that Lemberg railway was the turning point for Mr. Brassy. Because now the bank's returned to normal, I hear that he's started to repay all his loans. In fact, we all believe that soon he will be in exactly the same position as he was before. And a few of us are wondering if he'll then decide to rein things in a bit and take life a little more slowly. None of us are getting any younger after all.
Dominique Verdier, London, 1868. Paris, Mr. Brassy says, pack a bag. Well, Maria is not keen. That business last year had been a nasty shock for us all. And anyway, little Mabel is due a visit. But I suppose this is no surprise. Mr. Brassy left all the care of the boys to Maria. So, no one could expect him to take much notice of a grandchild. I have some business here, and after that, we can have some time to ourselves, he says. Maria and I exchange a look. We both know what that will mean. Mr. Brassy's sightseeing, hours and hours around all the art galleries, and then, even worse, the buildings. And what does he do there? He just looks, and looks. That line, Maria, do you see it? No, I want to say. But of course, it is not my place. Cold, that's what it is. And my toes are like they are dead. Let us go. Please, let us go. Well, this time, at the end of it, he is sick. A bit of a cold, he says. But it sounds a bad cough to me. But do we stop and go home? No, we do not. Mr. Brassy has his schedule, and that schedule means we go on the night train to Cologne, and when we arrive at 4 o'clock in the morning, we have to do more sightseeing. By the end of it, Mr. Brassy is coughing and coughing, but still it goes on. The Alps first, to see a tunnel. Mr. Brassy is interested in this tunnel because it is using an invention he had paid for, which is like a hammer banging very fast, and he was going to use it himself until the Italians stole the contract. Oh, they are a bad lot, the Italians. All of them are criminals. So, we stand and look at this tunnel. And in fact, this tunnel is a very bad thing as far as Mr. Brassy is concerned, because he is building a railway on top. And once that tunnel was finished, who would want the railway? And so, we go and look at that railway too, even though it is not quite finished yet. Still, we get home in June, and he is still coughing very bad. So, Mrs. Brassy sulks until he agrees he will rest until he is better, which he does, and all is quiet until October, when he hears that his railway has finished. And then there is a row. I go to my room and shut the door. The railway is finished, and Mr. Brassy is insisting he go to the opening, even though his cough is still there. And so, off he goes, on his own. And the next thing we know, there is a telegram. Brassy, dangerously ill. Stop. Please, come at once. Stop. What a terrible journey this is. One train, then the next. And we're all fearing that we'll be too late. But when we get to Turin, we find out that he's moved on to Milan, and then to Venice. And there he is, sitting up writing in his silly little book, his face wet with sweat. The room, I have to say, is a little bit smelly. But Maria throws her arms around him, bursts into tears. As do we all. Stupid man.
Sometimes Umberto and I talk of starting off a masonry business. We should make tombstones, says Umberto, in commemoration to all the people. But then we remember the boulder that the St. Lawrence River made, the one that we took from the riverbed and placed it upon the memorial in memory of all those thousands of victims of the plague. The worn beauty of the shape, from the rolling and rolling. I suppose it reminded me of Mr. Brassy. The way the man keeps on going. There's always another line to build, men to employ, places to link. And what he said to me in the quarry that day, he was right. We are all the same. We all have to keep on going, because the only alternative is to stop.
It is strange to think of Thomas Brassey as old, but I suppose we both are. I hear he's almost lame from a palsy, but still insists on clambering up cuttings, and even though he can only drag one leg, he still balances on planks over chasms. He must be unbearable to live with.
Moldavia, Peru, Delhi, Calcutta, Argentina, Austria, Prussia, Canada, Each time I hear about Mr. Brassy, he has a new contract. Some of us retire. But with each year, Mr. Brassy just seems to find new energy. But just last April and May, he went on one of his grand tours, visiting so many countries, I lost count. And now, another trip in October. Why, I keep asking myself. What drives him? Is it optimism? Or the fear of it all ending?
The final tramp. That's what some of us call it. Mile after mile. Across the whole country. Navvies for the most part. Faces I know from way past. Each of us, cap in hand, now we've reached the door.
How do they know? These people. Who has told them? Some have tears. No shame, no stiff top lip. We only want to see him again. Just one word. Of course, I tell them to go away. Have you no feeling? I ask, no sense? Why would you come to disturb a dying... And I stop. There is Maria. Let them come, she said. But madame! No. Let them come. And she gestures them inside where he is waiting. He wants to see them.
When I first came to this land, I was not a wealthy man. So I bought myself a shack, and I did what I could. And I called my shack Rika my bad. But the land was sweet and good, and I did what I could. When I first came to this land, I was not a wealthy man. So I bought myself a farm, and I did what I could. And I called my farm muscle in my arm. I called my shack Rika my back.